Could you survive a life where every moment was dictated, every whisper heard, and every desire denied? What would happen if you dared to defy the powerful medieval church in the 13th century, a time when faith ruled absolutely? Number 9. The cloister's unyielding walls. For a medieval nun, the monastery walls were not merely a physical boundary. They represented an unbreakable vow, a sacred enclosure, a spiritual safeguard against the temptations and distractions of the outside world. This rule, known as enclosure or cloister, was one of the foundational pillars of monastic life for women from the earliest centuries of Christianity, rigorously enforced throughout the medieval period, particularly after reforms of the 11th and 12th centuries. The purpose of this strict isolation was multifaceted. Church believed that perpetual enclosure fostered a deeper contemplative life, protecting the nuns from worldly corruption and allowing them to focus solely on their spiritual journey toward God. It was also seen as a measure to protect the nuns themselves, ensuring their safety and the preservation of their chastity in a society that often viewed unaccompanied women with suspicion or as vulnerable. The monastic rule, whether it was the widespread rule of Saint Benedict or the stricter constitutions of orders like the Cistercians or Poor Clares, meticulously outlined the parameters of this enclosure. It meant that a nun, once she had taken her solemn vows, was expected never to leave the monastery grounds for the rest of her life, barring the most extraordinary and rare circumstances, and even then, only with explicit written permission from the highest ecclesiastical authorities, such as a bishop or the Pope himself. The monastery buildings were typically designed to reinforce this enclosure. High walls, often fortified, surrounded the entire precinct. Gates were kept locked, and often there was a porter or gatekeeper, usually a lay sister or a male servant, whose sole duty was to control access. The architecture itself mirrored the rule. The cloister walk, a covered passageway around a central courtyard, was the heart of the monastic complex, from which all other essential areas, the church, the refectory, the dormitory, the chapter house, radiated. This design ensured that a nun's entire daily life, from prayer to manual labor, from eating to sleeping, took place within these hallowed, confined spaces. Even interactions with visitors were strictly controlled, taking place through grilles, often with a screen or veil to prevent any physical contact or clear sight of the nun. Deliveries of food and supplies were managed through turntables or small secure hatches, further limiting direct contact with anyone from the outside world. This physical separation was a constant, tangible reminder of the nun's commitment to a life apart. Breaking the rule of enclosure was considered a grave offense, an act of rebellion not just against the monastic superior, the abbess, but against the very spiritual foundation of the nun's consecrated life, and indeed against God himself. A nun who attempted to leave the monastery without permission, or who somehow managed to slip away, was immediately pursued. The monastic community, often with the assistance of local secular authorities or even the bishop's representatives, would mount an effort to apprehend her. The perceived danger she posed both to her own soul and to the reputation of the monastery was immense. Her flight was not just a personal transgression, but a public scandal that could bring dishonor upon the entire convent and cast doubt upon the sanctity of monastic life. Upon her capture and return, or even if she was discovered planning an escape, the consequences were severe, reflecting the gravity of her broken vow. The most common immediate punishment was public penance. This involved the nun being forced to prostrate herself before the entire community in the chapter house, confessing her sin of disobedience and attempted escape. She might be required to wear a special mark of shame, perhaps a specific color or a distinctive garment, for a period signifying her transgression to all. Her place in the choir during divine services and at the refectory table during meals would be downgraded, often forcing her to sit in the lowest, most inconspicuous position. She would be stripped of any office or responsibility she held within the convent, such as being a prioress, a cellarer, or a sacristan, and would be assigned the most menial and unpleasant tasks like cleaning latrines or tending to the sick with infectious diseases. Beyond these acts of public humiliation and demotion, more severe penalties awaited. For a first offense, especially if repentance was perceived as genuine, the nun might face a prolonged period of strict solitary confinement within the monastery's boundaries. This could mean being locked in a small, unheated cell, sometimes even a dedicated monastic prison cell with only minimal food and water, often bread and water, for days or weeks. During this time, she would be forbidden from attending communal prayers, from speaking to anyone, and from receiving any comfort. Purpose was to break her will, to force her to contemplate her sin, and to return to a state of humble obedience. Manual labor might be imposed, often repetitive and physically demanding tasks designed to both occupy her and humble her further. She might be required to recite specific prayers or psalms hundreds of times a day as a form of spiritual penance. Repeated attempts to break enclosure or particularly scandalous escapes could lead to even harsher consequences. A nun who persistently tried to flee or who was found to be maintaining illicit contact with people outside the cloister, circumventing the grills and turnstiles, could face a more extreme form of confinement, sometimes in a deep dungeon or a dark, damp monastic lockup where food was meager and light was scarce. There were instances, though rare and considered extreme, where corporal punishment was administered, such as flogging, particularly if the escape was accompanied by other transgressions like theft or consorting with laypeople in scandalous ways. While less common for nuns than monks, such punishments were not entirely unheard of, especially in the earliest or most austere orders or during periods of intense monastic reform where discipline was paramount. In the most extreme cases, especially if a nun's actions brought severe public scandal to the monastery or indicated a complete rejection of her vows, she could face excommunication from the church, or more commonly expulsion from the monastic order. A nun, having dedicated her life to God, had no property, no family support to return to, and no social standing outside the convent. To be cast out was to be thrust into a world for which she was utterly unprepared, often facing destitution, public scorn, and eternal damnation in the eyes of society. She would be stripped of her habit, her head shaven, and cast out of the monastery gates, often with nothing but the clothes on her back. Records from episcopal visitations, where bishops would inspect monasteries, frequently document cases of nuns being disciplined for infractions of enclosure, testifying to the perennial struggle to enforce this fundamental rule. The rule of enclosure was not just a guideline, it was a cage of spiritual and physical commitment, and its boundaries were protected with unwavering severity. Number 8. The solemn vow of pure body and soul. The vow of chastity was perhaps the most defining and strictly enforced rule for medieval nuns, standing as an absolute and unwavering commitment to spiritual purity and celibacy. Upon entering the monastery and professing her solemn vows, a nun swore before God and the community to live a life entirely without sexual or romantic relations. This was not merely a prohibition on physical acts. It encompassed a broader commitment to purity of thought, word, and deed. The theological underpinning of this vow was profound. By forsaking earthly marriage and carnal desires, the nun consecrated herself as a bride of Christ, dedicating her entire being, body and soul, to God. This spiritual marriage was considered the highest form of devotion, elevating the nun to a sacred status within the Church. The medieval Church believed that celibacy freed the individual from worldly attachments, allowing for an unhindered focus on prayer, contemplation, and service to God. It was a radical act of self-denial, a complete rejection of the societal expectation for women to marry and bear children, instead channeling all energies into a spiritual fertility. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided most Western monastic communities, though not explicitly detailing punishments for breaches of chastity, presuming such a sin would lead to automatic expulsion, nonetheless established a rigid framework designed to prevent any opportunity for unchaste thoughts or actions. Monastic customaries and episcopal visitation records from across the medieval period illustrate the meticulous efforts taken to uphold this vow. Nuns were expected to maintain a constant vigilance over their senses. Their eyes were to be downcast, their demeanor humble, their speech modest and devoid of frivolity. Any behavior that could be construed as flirtatious, even innocent laughter, or prolonged eye contact with a man, was discouraged and often disciplined. Physical contact, even between nuns, was limited to necessary tasks, and any intimate physical affection was strictly forbidden to prevent disordered affections or carnal friendships that could lead to spiritual or emotional attachments seen as rivaling their love for God. Breaking the vow of chastity was considered the most egregious sin a nun could commit, an ultimate betrayal of her sacred marriage to Christ and a profound defilement of her consecrated body. Consequences were immediate, severe, and designed to purge the community of such a grave stain. The most common and terrifying outcome for a nun found guilty of sexual misconduct, whether with a man from outside the monastery or, in extremely rare but documented cases, with another nun or a male cleric, was immediate and irreversible expulsion. This was not a temporary suspension. It was a permanent severance from monastic life. The monastic habit, the symbol of her consecrated status, would be brutally stripped from her. Her hair, which was often shaven when she took her vows as a sign of humility, would likely be shaven again, or she might be presented with a public shaming where her head was uncovered in defiance of monastic custom. She would then be cast out of the monastery gates, often destitute and utterly disgraced. The social ramifications of expulsion for unchastity were devastating. A nun, having renounced her family and secular life, had no place to go, no means of support, and a ruined reputation. She would face severe social ostracism, as her sin was not just against the church, but against the very moral fabric of medieval society. Many expelled nuns would have been forced into desperate circumstances, sometimes resorting to begging or even prostitution to survive, fulfilling the dire warnings often preached against the dangers of breaking such vows. For those found to be pregnant, the scandal was even greater, undeniable evidence of her transgression. Such women were often sent to isolated penitential houses, if they existed, or simply abandoned. Child, if born, would carry the stigma of illegitimacy and would also face a life of hardship and social disadvantage. Beyond expulsion, the church had other tools of punishment and humiliation. Before expulsion, or in cases where the evidence was strong but perhaps not entirely definitive for outright expulsion, a nun might face public ritualistic humiliation. This included being forced to lie prostrate before the entire community in the chapter house, confessing her sin in stark terms, sometimes with her garments disarranged to signify her spiritual nudity and shame. She might be subjected to public penance, forced to eat on the floor in the refectory, or confined to a cell for an extended period with a diet of bread and water, often in silence to reflect on her grave transgression. These punishments were intended to inflict maximum spiritual and psychological suffering, serving as a stark warning to other nuns about the extreme consequences of breaching this vow. In more lenient, though still severe cases for lesser forms of unchastity, such as scandalous behavior that merely suggested impropriety, without direct proof of sexual activity, a nun might be confined to a solitary cell within the monastery, sometimes cultivated in pace oration and rigorous penance. These cells were often bare, cold, and dark, designed for a lifetime of suffering and atonement. She would be stripped of her name, her identity, and all privileges, living a life of extreme austerity and complete separation even from the rest of the monastic community. Such confinement was a slow-living death, a punishment considered more severe than outright expulsion by some, as it denied even the possibility of a different, albeit disgraced, life outside the walls. The enforcement of chastity was ruthless, because the purity of the monastic body was believed to directly reflect the sanctity of the church itself, and any stain on it was seen as a threat to the spiritual order of the entire world. Number 7. The burden of belonging nothing. The rule of poverty and the prohibition against private property were fundamental tenets of monastic life for medieval nuns, mirroring the example of Christ and the early apostles who lived communally, owning nothing individually. This rule, deeply embedded in the rule of Saint Benedict and amplified by stricter orders like the Poor Clares, mandated that nuns should possess absolutely no personal belongings. Everything within the monastery, from the clothes on their backs to the books they read, from the food they ate to the very cell they slept in, belonged to the community as a whole, not to any individual nun. This radical renunciation of personal possessions was not merely an economic principle, it was a profound spiritual discipline intended to foster humility, detach the nun from worldly attachments, and encourage a complete reliance on divine providence and the communal support of her sisters. It was believed that private ownership led to avarice, envy, and division, distracting the soul from its primary pursuit of God. When a woman entered the monastery, especially as a fully professed nun, she would formally divest herself of all her worldly goods. Any dowry brought with her would be given to the monastery for the common good, not held in her name. Personal clothes, jewelry, and any other possessions would be distributed or sold, with the proceeds going to the convent. She would then be issued the simple monastic habit and her few necessary items, perhaps a prayer book, a rosary, and basic bedding, all of which were technically communal property, merely loaned for her use. The goal was to eliminate any sense of mine and foster ours, creating a spiritual equality among the sisters, where all shared equally in the resources of the community, relying on the abbess and the cellarer for their needs. Breaking the rule of poverty and holding private property was considered a serious transgression, undermining the communal spirit and spiritual intention of monastic life. The ways a nun might break this rule varied. She might secretly retain personal items brought from her former life, such as a piece of jewelry, a fine linen, or a personal letter. She might attempt to receive gifts or money from family members visiting her, keeping them hidden from the abbess and the community. She might even attempt to trade or sell items within the monastery, creating a clandestine economy among the sisters, or hoard provisions beyond her allotted share. Even desiring personal items or lamenting their absence could be seen as a breach of the spirit of poverty. The very act of having a favorite pen, a particular piece of cloth, or a hidden sweetmeat marked an attachment that contradicted the ideal of absolute communal ownership. The discovery of a nun possessing private property or engaging in secret transactions would lead to significant disciplinary action. The initial response would often be public exposure and humiliation. In the chapter house, during the daily gathering where faults were confessed and corrected, the offending nun would be made to kneel and confess her transgression before the entire community. The offending item, whether it was a small coin, a piece of embroidery, or a hidden treat, would be publicly displayed, emphasizing the nun's deviation from her vow. She might be required to perform an act of public penance, such as eating her meals on the floor for a designated period, or reciting extra prayers while prostrating herself. The hidden item itself would be immediately confiscated and either returned to the common store, donated to the poor, or even destroyed, depending on its nature and the severity of the offense. For instance, if it was money, it would be added to the communal funds. If it was a personal vanity item, it might be broken or burned. The nun herself would face a temporary reduction in her privileges and status. She might be forbidden from speaking outside of necessary conversations, denied participation in certain communal activities, or assigned the most menial and undesirable tasks, such as cleaning the pigsty or tending to the sick with highly contagious diseases. Her bed might be moved to a less comfortable or more exposed part of the dormitory, or she might be assigned a more austere cell. For repeated offenses, or for more significant attempts to amass wealth, or engage in secret dealings, the punishments escalate. A nun who was caught hoarding significant amounts of food or who was found to have secretly received a substantial sum of money from her family might face stricter confinement. She could be confined to a solitary cell, often with a reduced diet of bread and water for several days or weeks, forcing her to reflect on her disobedience and attachment to worldly goods. She might be deprived of certain comforts, such as a blanket, a cushion, or even her shoes, for a time, to further impress upon her the meaning of destitution. Her ability to interact with her sisters would be severely curtailed, and she would be under constant supervision by the abbess or the prioress. In extreme cases, particularly if the nun showed no sign of repentance or continued to defy the rule, leading to significant disruption or suspicion within the community, she could face the ultimate penalty of expulsion. While less common for poverty alone than for chastity or enclosure violations, a persistent refusal to abandon private ownership could be seen as a fundamental rejection of the monastic way of life. The logic was that if a nun was unwilling to shed her attachments to the world, she could not truly live a consecrated life. Expulsion for persistent avarice would lead to the same fate of destitution and social ruin as other expulsions, albeit with a different specific stain on her reputation. The strict enforcement of poverty aimed to ensure that nuns lived not as individuals, but as an inseparable part of a single unified body, dedicated solely to God and the spiritual mission of the monastery. Number 6. The unbroken breath of silence. Silence was not merely the absence of noise within a medieval monastery. It was a profound spiritual discipline, a constant practice that permeated every aspect of a nun's daily life. Far from being a casual rule, silence was considered a foundational element of the contemplative life, enabling nuns to cultivate interior peace, listen more attentively to God's voice, and avoid the spiritual dangers of idle chatter, gossip, and frivolous speech. The rule of Saint Benedict, the bedrock of most Western monasticism, exhorted monks and nuns to cultivate love of silence, emphasizing that speech should be granted to the disciples to speak very little. Specific times and places were designated as periods of absolute silence, requiring complete stillness and the suppression of any spoken word. These included the church during divine services, the refectory during meals, the dormitory during resting hours, and often the cloister and chapter house during certain periods of the day. The purpose of this rigorous silence was manifold. It was believed to prevent sins of the tongue, such as slander, detraction, and lies. It fostered humility, discouraging self-promotion and argument. It allowed for constant prayer and meditation, transforming every moment into an opportunity for spiritual reflection. Even outside of designated silent periods, speech was expected to be measured, brief, and purposeful, limited to what was strictly necessary for work or spiritual guidance. Nuns often communicated through a system of sign language, a specific monastic sign language to convey essential needs without breaking the profound quiet. This silent communication allowed for the functioning of the community without disrupting the spiritual atmosphere that silence was meant to cultivate. The very air of the monastery was to be thick with spiritual stillness, punctuated only by the solemn sounds of chanting bells and necessary activity. Breaking the rule of silence was a common infraction, but it was taken very seriously, for it was seen as a breach of discipline, a distraction from spiritual focus, and an invitation to worldly thought. A nun might break silence by speaking unnecessarily during silent periods, by engaging in gossip or frivolous conversation with a sister, by laughing too loudly, or by simply being generally boisterous. Even whispering or making unnecessary noises, such as shuffling feet or dropping items, could be considered a breach, if done out of carelessness or disrespect for the rule. The abbess, the prioress, or even other vigilant nuns were expected to observe and report such transgressions. A nun who frequently broke silence might be seen as lacking in spiritual discipline, prone to worldly temptations, and disruptive to the contemplative environment. consequences for breaking the rule of silence varied depending on the frequency and severity of the transgression, but they were consistently applied to reinforce the importance of the quietude. For a minor first-time offense, such as a casual whisper during a meal or a misplaced giggle in the dormitory, the nun would often be publicly reprimanded in the chapter house. She would be made to kneel before the abbess and the entire community, confess her fault, and ask for forgiveness. Her penance might involve a brief period of isolation from the group during recreation or being made to eat her next meal at a separate, less desirable table, a symbolic separation from the community's harmony. She might also be required to recite extra psalms or undertake a specific, unpleasant manual task as a form of atonement. Repeated or more significant breaches of silence, such as persistent gossiping, engaging in arguments, or spreading rumors, would incur more severe punishments. The nun might be forbidden from speaking to anyone, even during permitted periods, for a specified number of days or weeks. This vow of silence within a vow of silence was a profound social isolation, forcing her into an internal world of self-reflection and penance. During this time, she would communicate only through the monastic sign language, if at all, and only for absolute necessities. She might be assigned to a solitary task such as spinning wool or copying manuscripts to occupy her mind while denying her the opportunity for conversation. Her seat in the refectory and the choir might be moved to the very back, furthest from the abbess, symbolizing her disconnection from the disciplined heart of the community. In cases where a nun's talkativeness led to serious disruptions, discord, or the spread of dangerous information within the monastery, or if she showed no willingness to reform her behavior, the penalties could escalate further. She might be confined to a solitary cell for an extended period, often with a significantly reduced diet, experiencing the full weight of physical and social isolation. This confinement was meant to forcefully impose the silence she struggled to maintain, breaking her will and compelling her to embrace the spiritual discipline. During these periods, she would be denied any visitors, even other nuns, and her interactions would be limited to the delivery of food and water. For chronic offenders, or those whose speech was deemed truly harmful and scandalous, particularly if it involved slander against the abbess or serious heresy, the ultimate sanction of expulsion could be considered. Although extreme for silence alone, persistent disruption and a lack of spiritual discipline through unbridled speech could be interpreted as a rejection of the monastic way of life itself. The sacred quiet of the medieval monastery was fiercely guarded, a silent testament to the nuns' unyielding pursuit of spiritual perfection. Number 5. The absolute yoke of submission. Obedience was the cornerstone of monastic life for medieval nuns, considered the highest virtue and the most critical vow after chastity. Upon entering the monastery, a nun made a solemn promise of absolute submission to the abbess and to the monastic rule, especially the rule of Saint Benedict, which explicitly states, "The first step of humility is obedience without delay." This was not merely about following instructions, it was a profound spiritual discipline, a complete surrender of individual will to the collective wisdom of the community and the divine authority embodied in the abbess. The abbess, as the spiritual mother and temporal leader of the convent, was seen as acting in God's stead, and her commands were to be obeyed instantly and without question, even if they seemed difficult, inconvenient, or against personal preference. This radical self-abnegation was believed to eliminate pride, foster humility, and align the nun's will with God's will, leading her to spiritual perfection. Every aspect of a nun's day, from the moment she rose for matins in the pre-dawn darkness to the moment she lay down to sleep after compline, was dictated by the rule and the abbess's directives. Her tasks, her schedule, her place in the choir, her portion at meals, her clothing, all were determined by the authority figure. She was expected to perform her duties cheerfully, without grumbling or argument, even when faced with unpleasant or arduous tasks. The very act of questioning a command, even internally, was considered a spiritual flaw, a sign of pride, and a lack of trust in divine providence. The abbess held immense power, not only in governing the daily life of the convent but also in the spiritual guidance of each nun, acting as a confessor and disciplinarian. Her authority was viewed as divine, making disobedience an offense against God Himself. Breaking the rule of obedience was thus a deeply serious matter, interpreted as a direct challenge to the divinely ordained order of the monastery and a rejection of the nun's solemn vow. Disobedience could manifest in countless ways: failing to rise for divine office, neglecting assigned duties, grumbling about tasks, questioning the abbess's decisions, speaking out of turn, failing to keep silence, or even simply displaying a sullen or rebellious attitude. Any act, large or small, that demonstrated a lack of willing submission to authority or the established rule was seen as a dangerous crack in the spiritual foundation of the community. Even subtle forms of resistance, such as passive aggression or procrastination, were noted and addressed. The consequences for disobedience were swift and varied, proportional to the perceived severity and frequency of the transgression. For a minor act of disobedience, such as neglecting a small duty or showing a moment of sullenness, the nun would be immediately corrected, often by the abbess or prioress herself. She would be required to perform an act of public penance in the chapter house, prostrating herself and confessing her fault before the assembled community. Asking for forgiveness, she might be assigned an additional, particularly humbling task, such as cleaning the monastery's public areas or serving others during a meal while eating nothing herself. Her place in the choir or at the refectory table might be temporarily downgraded to the lowest position, a visual symbol of her spiritual fall. Repeated acts of disobedience or more significant challenges to authority, such as openly defying the abbess, refusing to perform a command, or inciting other nuns to rebellion, led to far harsher penalties. The disobedient nun would be subjected to periods of severe social isolation and physical hardship. She might be forbidden from speaking to her sisters even during permitted periods for an extended time. Her meals would be reduced to bread and water, and she might be forced to eat them alone on the floor, separate from the communal table. She would be stripped of any special privileges or responsibilities she held, such as being a reader at meals or assisting in the infirmary. She might be assigned exceptionally arduous or unpleasant manual labor, designed to break her will and instill a sense of humility through physical exertion. For persistent and grave disobedience, particularly if it was deemed to be a source of scandal or rebellion that threatened the stability of the entire convent, the ultimate penalties awaited. A nun who consistently refused to obey, whose defiance undermined the abbess's authority, or who encouraged others to reject the rule, could be confined to a solitary cell, often a monastic prison cell, for an extended period. These cells were typically cold, dark, and uncomfortable, with only minimal provisions, designed to break the nun's spirit through extreme deprivation and isolation. During this time, she would be allowed no communication, no contact with the outside world, and no participation in communal life, forcing her into a deep, painful introspection on her spiritual state and her broken vow. In the most extreme and rare cases where a nun's disobedience was deemed incorrigible or her actions truly scandalous and damaging to the monastic community, expulsion was the final terrifying consequence. This was a last resort, as it meant casting out a soul consecrated to God, but it was seen as necessary to preserve the spiritual integrity and discipline of the monastery. An expelled nun, stripped of her habit and social standing, would face a life of hardship and shame, having alienated both her monastic family and often her secular family. The severity of punishments for disobedience tegues the absolute importance of this vow in medieval monastic life, for it was believed that only through complete submission could a nun truly empty herself to be filled with God's will and achieve salvation. Number 4. The unadorned garb of humility. The rule regarding modesty in dress and appearance for medieval nuns was far more than a simple dress code. It was a profound theological statement, a constant external manifestation of their internal spiritual commitment to humility, detachment from worldly vanity, and identification with the poor. Every aspect of a nun's attire and grooming was meticulously prescribed by the rule and customaries of her order, designed to strip away individual identity and promote spiritual uniformity. The monastic habit, typically consisting of a tunic, scapular, veil, and wimple, was chosen for its simplicity, modesty, and uniformity. Covered the body almost entirely, concealing the shape of the figure, and the wimple and veil obscured the hair and most of the face, minimizing any opportunity for vanity or sensual allure. This uniform attire was a visual symbol of the nun's renunciation of the world and her embrace of a life consecrated to God. Beyond the prescribed habit, nuns were strictly forbidden from possessing or wearing any form of personal adornment, luxury items, or anything that might draw attention to themselves or suggest a worldly attachment. This meant no jewelry, no decorative pins, no fine fabrics, no elaborate embroidery. Their clothing was to be made of coarse, simple materials, often undyed wool, reflecting their commitment to poverty and austerity. Hair, often considered a symbol of feminine beauty in the secular world, was shaven when a woman entered the novitiate and then kept covered by the wimple and veil at all times, a constant reminder of her humility and renunciation of worldly attractions. Similarly, personal grooming was minimal. Cleanliness was necessary, but any form of beautification was strictly forbidden. Nuns were not to use perfumes, cosmetics, or engage in elaborate hairstyling, even if their hair was allowed to grow a little under the veil. The ideal was a stark, unadorned appearance that spoke only of devotion and self-denial. Breaking the rule of modesty in dress and appearance was considered a direct assault on the virtues of humility and poverty, and a dangerous flirtation with worldly vanity, which could lead to more serious spiritual transgressions. A nun might break this rule by secretly retaining a piece of jewelry from her former life, by adding a decorative embroidery to her habit, by attempting to style her hair under her veil, by using scented orptain or soaps, or by attempting to obtain or wear clothing made of finer, more luxurious materials than permitted. Even the simple act of trying to make her habit fit more flatteringly, or taking excessive care in her appearance beyond basic cleanliness, could be seen as a transgression. These actions indicated an attachment to self, a yearning for worldly recognition, and a lack of commitment to the monastic ideal of anonymity and spiritual focus. When a nun was discovered to have violated the rule of modesty, the consequences were designed to publicly shame her, strip away her pride, and reassert the community's commitment to humility. For minor offenses, such as a hidden ring or a subtle attempt at vanity, the nun would be made to confess her fault publicly in the chapter house. The offending item would be confiscated and often publicly destroyed or displayed as a symbol of her worldliness and a warning to others. She might be required to wear a mark of shame, for a period perhaps, a coarse patch sewn onto her habit, or be made to sit in the lowest seat in the refectory or choir, signifying her temporary disgrace. She might also be assigned particularly humbling tasks, such as cleaning the monastery latrines, scrubbing floors, or tending to the sick, which would emphasize her servile role and break down any lingering sense of personal pride. For more significant or repeated breaches, such as consistently attempting to adorn herself or secretly possessing multiple forbidden items, the punishments escalated. The nun might be subjected to a stricter regimen of fasting, denied certain foods or comforts she was accustomed to. She could be confined to a solitary cell within the monastery, often for several days or weeks, with only the bare necessities forcing her into a painful introspection on her spiritual state and her attachment to worldly things. During this confinement, she would be denied any mirrors, any personal items, and any opportunity to engage in vanity. Her interactions would be limited to the abbess or prioress, who would sternly lecture her on the spiritual dangers of pride and the importance of renouncing the world. In severe cases, particularly if the nun's vanity was seen as persistent, incorrigible, or leading to significant scandal or spiritual corruption within the community, the abbess might resort to even more drastic measures. This could include a public ritual of humiliation where her hair, if it had been allowed to grow even slightly, was publicly shaven, or her head was uncovered in front of the community. She might be forced to wear a particularly drab and unseemly version of the habit, or even be temporarily stripped of her habit and forced to wear simple, coarse lay clothing as a symbolic removal of her consecrated status. While direct expulsion for modesty infractions alone was rare, a persistent and unrepentant attachment to vanity could be interpreted as a fundamental rejection of the monastic vow of spiritual poverty and humility, and thus contribute to a decision to expel her, leaving her utterly without recourse in the world she had so foolishly clung to. The austere appearance of medieval nuns was not merely a matter of clothing. It was a visible testament to their spiritual nakedness before God, a commitment to shedding all that was not divine. Number 3. The hunger and thirst for righteousness. Fasting and abstinence were not occasional acts of piety for medieval nuns, but deeply ingrained, constant practices that shaped their daily lives, serving as fundamental disciplines for spiritual growth and self-denial. The rule of Saint Benedict and the more rigorous constitutions of subsequent orders meticulously outlined a complex system of dietary restrictions, fast days, and periods of abstinence. These practices were rooted in ancient Christian tradition, understood as a way to mortify the flesh, purify the soul, and draw closer to God by denying worldly pleasures and desires. It was believed that physical hunger could sharpen spiritual appetite, making the nun more attuned to divine grace and less susceptible to the temptations of gluttony and earthly indulgence. The rules for diet varied by monastic order and by the liturgical calendar, but generally nuns were expected to observe strict limitations on food and drink. Meat was often forbidden entirely, or allowed only for the sick or the elderly. Dairy products and eggs might be restricted during certain seasons, particularly Lent and Advent. Even when permitted meals were typically sparse and simple, consisting of bread, vegetables, pulses, and perhaps a small amount of fish. The number of meals per day was also prescribed, often only 2 during most of the year, with only 1 light meal during periods of severe fasting like Lent. Wine or other alcoholic beverages were generally forbidden or allowed only in very limited quantities for health reasons. Meals were taken in silence in the refectory, further emphasizing the communal aspect of their austerity and preventing any enjoyment of food as a social pleasure. The goal was to eat for sustenance, not for pleasure, fostering a constant awareness of their dependence on God's provision rather than their own desires. Breaking the rule of fasting and abstinence was considered a serious offense, undermining the spiritual discipline of the entire community and indicating a lack of self-control and spiritual commitment. A nun might break this rule by secretly consuming forbidden foods, such as meat, dairy, or richer fare, perhaps, obtained from family visitors or through clandestine means. She might eat outside of designated meal times, taking extra portions or consuming more than her allotted share. Even complaining about the meager diet or showing excessive eagerness for food could be seen as a transgression of the spirit of the rule. Transgression was not just about the food itself, but about the failure of the nun's will to control her bodily appetites, which was seen as a gateway to other sins and a sign of spiritual weakness. When a nun was discovered to have violated the rule of fasting or abstinence, the consequences were tailored to reinforce the discipline of self-denial. For a minor first-time offense, such as sneaking a forbidden bite or taking an extra portion, the nun would face public humiliation in the chapter house. She would be made to confess her greed or lack of self-control before the assembled community. Her penance might involve being made to eat her next meal on the floor, apart from her sisters, or being given an even more meager portion of food for several days. She might also be required to perform an additional period of strict fasting, beyond what was already prescribed for the community, as a form of atonement. She would be denied any small treats or comforts that might occasionally be allowed for others, reinforcing her punishment through deprivation. Repeated or more significant breaches of the dietary rules, such as habitual gluttony, hoarding food, or secretly conspiring to obtain prohibited items, would incur more severe penalties. The nun would be subjected to prolonged periods of strict bread and water diet, often for days or even weeks, significantly weakening her and serving as a harsh physical reminder of her transgression. She might be confined to a solitary cell within the monastery, with her food delivered through a small hatch, experiencing complete isolation and deprivation. During this confinement, her diet would be meticulously controlled, and she would be denied any form of communal comfort or interaction, forcing her to confront her lack of spiritual discipline in solitude. Her ability to participate in communal life would be severely curtailed, and she would be stripped of any special duties or responsibilities she held within the convent. In extreme cases, particularly if a nun's defiance of the dietary rules was seen as persistent and scandalous, leading to serious health issues from overindulgence or undermining the spiritual austerity of the entire community, the abbess might consider the most severe measures, while direct expulsion for gluttony was less common than for chastity or enclosure. A continuous and unrepentant refusal to adhere to the fundamental rule of fasting and abstinence could be interpreted as a rejection of the monastic way of life itself. Such a nun might be isolated entirely, forced to live in a state of permanent penance, or in rare, severe cases, deemed incorrigible and expelled, left to face the world she had so carelessly indulged in. The rigorous control over diet in medieval monasteries was not merely about food. It was about the discipline of the will, the mortification of the flesh, and the constant striving for spiritual purity, and any deviation was met with a firm hand to guide the soul back to righteousness. Number 2. The sealed gates to the secular world. Beyond the physical enclosure of the monastery walls, medieval nuns lived under an equally strict rule governing communication and contact with the outside world. This regulation was not just about physical separation. It aimed to create a spiritual barrier, protecting the nuns from worldly distractions, gossip, and the temptations that contact with secular society could bring. The ideal was a complete detachment from the concerns, affections, and news of the world, allowing the nuns to focus solely on their spiritual journey and the life of their community. This rule applied to visitors, letters, and any form of unapproved communication. The purpose was to preserve the sanctity of the monastic environment, maintain discipline, and safeguard the nuns' vows, particularly those of chastity and poverty, which could be easily compromised by outside influences. Monastic customaries and the rule of Saint Benedict provided detailed guidelines for interaction with secular individuals. Visitors, even family members, were rarely allowed direct access to the nuns. Instead, meetings typically took place in a designated parlor or speaking room, separated by a double grille, often with a heavy curtain or screen to prevent clear sight and any physical contact. Conversations were supervised by a senior nun, often the prioress or discreet sister, to ensure that only necessary and appropriate topics were discussed, and that no forbidden items or messages were exchanged. These grilles were a constant physical reminder of the nuns' separation from the world. Similarly, receiving or sending personal letters was severely restricted, and often forbidden altogether without the abbess's explicit permission and scrutiny. Any correspondence had to be opened and read by the abbess or a trusted delegate to ensure it contained no worldly news, no requests for favors, and no attempts to undermine the nun's monastic commitment. Breaking the rule against unapproved visitors or outside communication was considered a serious violation, as it jeopardized the spiritual integrity of the individual nun and the entire community. A nun might break this rule by attempting to receive visitors without proper supervision, by communicating through an intermediary, by secretly exchanging letters with family or friends, or by obtaining news from the outside world that was deemed distracting or potentially corrupting. Even passing a small unauthorized item, like a piece of ribbon or a sweet, through the grill could be seen as a transgression, as it undermined the spirit of strict control and detachment. Such actions indicated a persistent attachment to worldly life, a lack of trust in the monastic discipline, and a potential for scandal that could damage the monastery's reputation. When a nun was discovered to have violated this rule, the consequences were designed to re-establish her detachment and reinforce the community's boundaries. For a minor offense, such as a brief, unsupervised conversation through the grill or the receipt of an unapproved letter, the nun would be publicly reprimanded in the chapter house. She would be made to confess her fault, expressing remorse for her attachment to the world. Her penance might involve a temporary suspension of all visits or external communication privileges, even supervised ones. She might be forbidden from acting as a porter or a host, duties that involved interaction with outsiders. She might also be required to perform additional prayers or a period of strict silence, forcing her to turn inward and away from worldly concerns. Repeated or more significant breaches, such as habitually engaging in clandestine communication, secretly meeting visitors in unapproved locations, a grave violation of enclosure, or receiving items that indicated an ongoing worldly lifestyle, would incur more severe penalties. The nun might be confined to a solitary cell within the monastery, often for several days or weeks, with her access to visitors completely revoked. During this confinement, she would be denied any external contact, emphasizing her isolation and giving her time to reflect on her disobedience and her spiritual priorities. Her meals would be reduced, and she would be stripped of any responsibilities within the convent. She might be subjected to constant surveillance by the abbess or prioress, ensuring no further breaches occurred. In the most severe cases, particularly if the nun's unauthorized communication led to serious scandal, brought disrepute to the monastery, or involved actions that threatened the well-being of the community, such as facilitating an escape or introducing forbidden ideas, the abbess might consider the ultimate penalty. A nun who consistently and unrepentantly defied the rule against outside communication, showing a complete disregard for her vows and the spiritual safety of the convent, could face expulsion. This was a dire outcome, as it thrust her back into the very world she had so eagerly sought to engage with, but now without any social standing, financial support, or reputation. She would be seen as having betrayed her sacred vows and having proven herself unfit for the consecrated life. The stringent control over external contact was crucial for maintaining the spiritual integrity and cloistered purity of medieval convents, ensuring that the nuns remained true to their sacred calling, untainted by the secular world's complexities and temptations. Number 1. The relentless call to perpetual prayer. The very heart of medieval monastic life for nuns lay an unwavering commitment to perpetual prayer, a relentless cycle of divine worship known as the divine office or liturgy of the hours. This was not merely a rule, but the fundamental purpose of their existence, the spiritual engine that drove every other aspect of their cloistered lives. From the rule of Saint Benedict, which meticulously outlined the 8 canonical hours, to the specific customaries of various orders, nuns were bound to attend communal prayer services throughout the day and night, transforming their monastery into a living temple of constant adoration. This cycle of prayer was believed to be their primary contribution to the world, a spiritual service offered on behalf of all humanity, interceding with God through their ceaseless supplication and praise. The divine office was a meticulously structured series of services typically observed at specific times, regardless of the season or personal inclination. These included matins and lauds in the dead of night or pre-dawn, prime at sunrise, terce mid-morning, sext midday, none mid-afternoon, vespers, sunset, and compline before bed. Each service involved chanting psalms, reading scripture, reciting prayers, and periods of silent contemplation. The nuns would rise in the dark, often in the bitter cold of winter, to gather in the choir stalls of the monastery church. Their voices blending in unison would fill the sacred space, a constant symphony of devotion. Outside of these communal prayers, Nuns were also expected to engage in personal prayer, meditation, and spiritual reading, cultivating a continuous interior disposition of prayerfulness. Their entire schedule was built around the bell that summoned them to the church, making prayer the central axis around which their lives revolved. Breaking the rule of perpetual prayer, whether through negligence, lateness, or outright absence, was considered one of the gravest offenses a nun could commit, for it struck at the very core of her vocation and the purpose of monastic life. It was seen as a profound disrespect for God, a dereliction of her sacred duty, and a betrayal of the community's spiritual mission. A nun might break this rule by habitually being late for an office, by falling asleep during services, by failing to complete her personal prayers, by feigning illness to avoid attendance, or by simply refusing to participate in the communal liturgy. Even a lack of attentiveness, a wandering mind during the chanting of psalms, could be perceived as a fault, as the intention was not just presence, but profound, heartfelt participation. Such failures indicated a lack of spiritual fervor, a dwindling commitment to her vows, and a dangerous path towards spiritual lukewarmness. When a nun was discovered to have violated the rule of prayer, the consequences were immediate and designed to reinstill spiritual discipline and remorse. For minor infractions, such as occasional lateness or inattentiveness, the nun would be subjected to public penance in the chapter house. She would be made to prostrate herself before the abbess and the entire community, confessing her spiritual laziness or negligence. Her penance might involve being forced to stand during the entire duration of an office while others sat, or being required to repeat certain psalms or prayers hundreds of times outside of the communal services. She might also be forbidden from receiving communion for a period, a severe spiritual punishment that cut her off from the central sacrament of the church. Her place in the choir might be moved to the very back, furthest from the altar, symbolizing her spiritual distance. Repeated or more significant breaches of the prayer rule, such as habitual absence from offices, feigning illness to avoid prayer, or showing open contempt for the liturgy, incurred far harsher penalties. The nun would be subjected to a prolonged period of strict isolation and severe penance. She could be confined to a solitary cell within the monastery, sometimes for days or weeks, with a reduced diet of bread and water. During this confinement, she would be strictly forbidden from attending any communal services, forced to experience the pain of spiritual separation from her sisters and from the very liturgy she had neglected. Her time in isolation would be filled with rigorous personal prayer and reflection, often under the stern supervision of the abbess or prioress, who would lecture her on the gravity of her spiritual failing and the importance of her vows. She would be denied any books except a psalter or the rule itself, forcing her to focus solely on the spiritual texts. In the most extreme cases, particularly if a nun's persistent defiance of the prayer rule was deemed incorrigible, demonstrating a complete rejection of her vocation and a scandalous disregard for God, the ultimate sanction of expulsion could be considered. While absence from prayer alone might not lead to immediate expulsion, unless combined with other severe offenses, a complete and unrepentant refusal to participate in the central act of monastic life could be interpreted as a total abandonment of her consecrated state. An expelled nun, having rejected the very essence of her spiritual calling, would face a life of profound shame and destitution in the secular world, having forfeited not only her sacred vows but also her spiritual purpose. The rigorous, relentless cycle of prayer in medieval convents was not a burden but the very breath of their existence, and any disruption to it was met with a stern hand ensuring that the continuous offering of praise to God remained unbroken.